Hi, guys. Welcome back to Integrated. My name is Angela Erickson, and I'm so glad that you are here today. I am sharing with you this interview with Dr. Carrie Gress, and I am really excited about it because she has a book that will be available at the end of January that you should totally go buy. Um, I am so impressed with this book. I finished it this morning. I wanted to make sure I had read the whole thing before I completed the introduction, and I am so glad that I did. It is such an important book, especially if you're somebody who has been studying feminism over the last several decades, what that actually looks like, because I think there are a lot of misconceptions about the origin story of feminism, and Dr. Gress does such a wonderful job parsing out what did first wave feminism actually look like? What about second wave? And how do we see it trickle down into our modern day church, frankly? I think she just did such a wonderful job with her book Something Wicked: Why Feminism and Christianity Can Be Fused. Sorry, I misspoke. She does such a great job with her book Something Wicked: Why Feminism Can't Be Fused with Christianity. I was so surprised. Like, there were things that I had recognized and some things that I already knew about feminism, but the thing that really struck me is that as you get to the end of the book, the way that she looks at the overall landscape of the impact that feminism has had on men and women, and what she proposes as different solutions. I'm not sure that there's one way. There are a lot of things that we need to do, basically, is what I think. But I think she really hits the nail on the head in her analysis of why feminism is the way that it is. It's inherently a sterile ideology. And the fact that so many Catholic women are still trying to fuse the two together, Dr. Gress does a really wonderful job demonstrating how Catholic feminism actually pulls women usually away from Catholicism and into this new religion called feminism instead of the other way around. When I worked in the pro life movement on a national level, it was very in vogue to call yourself a Catholic feminist or a pro life feminist, as if that was a way to build bridges between pro-lifers and people who were pro-abortion. We could say, "Oh, you're a feminist? I'm a feminist too. I'm just a feminist that believes we shouldn't kill babies." And that seems on the surface level really nice, but the reality is that feminism is not bringing people into a better, deeper understanding of Christianity. And so this idea that we're trying to build a bridge, it's a one-way bridge. It's a bridge that leads women out of the church and into a new religion called feminism as they seek to create this new woman, right? Dr. Gress just does a wonderful job explaining exactly how feminism was an ideology that started to give women more autonomy. And in this radical quest for independence, all they got really was isolation. And if that's not the root of the problem today, I don't really know what is. So it's a wonderful book. Amazing, really. I think everybody should read it. So go get your pre order. I'm going to link it in the description. But I hope that this interview helps tease out a little bit more of like what Dr. Gress talks about in her book. We didn't even get into half of it, frankly. So I hope that this gives you just a little bit of a taste. And then you need to go order the book and pre-order it. Pre-order it for your family and friends too. So it's really just that good. So thanks again for tuning into Integrated. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you next time. God bless. Welcome to Integrated. This is the podcast where we seek to bridge the gap between the intellect and the will so that we can grow as disciples of Christ, surrendering all that we are and all that we have to the truth. Hey, Dr. Carrie Gress, thank you for coming back on to Integrated. I think this is the second, is it the second or the third time that you've been on?
It might be the third. I can't remember. I know it's definitely the second, but anyway, great to be back here. So
I'm really excited. When you reached out to me to saying that you were publishing a book that was going to address feminism and specifically address Christian feminism or how it's infiltrated the church, I was like blown away because I feel like that's the third rail that nobody wants to touch really in the church right now. So what was the driver for you where you decided like somebody has to talk about it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think I finally realized it was a gap in my own work, because my own work has really been a journey itself. I mean, if you go back and look at the Anti-Marriage Exposed, which came out, gosh, 8 years ago. It's at that point I still thought that there could be a Catholic feminism, that Christian feminism was something that could work. I thought the first wave was good, all the things that most people believe in the culture today. And so then when I wrote The End of Woman, it was like, wait a minute, the first wave is actually a disaster and was really the cornerstone for everything that came after. If there hadn't been a first wave, the second wave never could have happened, especially the way that it did. So yeah, I think that, and then I began to look around and really see, feminism is this engine behind abortion in the culture. And so much of my work over, most of my adult life has been, how do we get rid of abortion? How do we help women? Why is it that women are killing their own children? I mean, this is historically totally anomalous in the numbers that we're seeing. It's actually the deadliest ideology in all of human history, if you look at the numbers. And so was at the heart of it was, how do we start addressing this? How do we get rid of this? It's such a scourge on our culture. Even the birth dearth that we're experiencing, immigration is part of it, because Native women aren't having their own children in Europe and the United States. So we have to import bodies or workers. So it's such a huge issue. And I think that, what I was seeing among Christians wasn't showing a lot of great fruit. It wasn't like there was some sort of pivot where people said, oh, well, this is Christian feminism, we can embrace this and wholeheartedly. I was just seeing way too much blending of the old feminism with what was supposed to be a new feminism. And those lines were not being held well. Because certainly John Paul II proposed a new feminism. He actually only used the word 3 times in his whole 26-year pontificate. So, when you start looking at the details of it, you begin to realize maybe there was a small chance, if people had really been strict about what John Paul II could have meant by feminism, but that's not happening at all. And so anyway, between that and then what I was seeing happen among Protestants as well. I mean, Protestants have their own set of problems that I go into in the book, usually much more connected with paganism or the occult.
Yeah.
Instead of being kind of in the taking on the intellectual marks of the first wave of feminism. But in any event, so yeah, that was part of it, was just, how do we get this out of our church? Why are we continually battling about this in a way that, first of all, wastes a lot of energy, second of all, is sowing incredible confusion among the faithful, and it's also dividing husbands and wives. It's making marriages more arduous and more difficult, all because we're trying to hang on to a word that actually isn't even from our tradition in the first place. So it was kind of all of these things together that made me realize, this has got to be addressed. And I'm the one to do it, because I understand the philosophy. I've been studying philosophy for all of my adult life, and I understand the underpinnings and how to read it, and just to see the dramatic difference between the roots of feminism and Christianity. They're not even from the same source whatsoever. And to try to marry them at this stage in the game, it just seems like it's a total waste of our energy, and we just need to, as a church, move on and start healing from it, instead of continually propagating it.
Right. It seems to me that there would be a distinction, for example, in previous cultures, like different pagans or people who had never encountered God, some heathens, whatever. And maybe they're engaged in some rituals, for example, that are ordered towards a God they think they understand. And we can baptize that when we realize it's not inherently evil. We adopt maybe so that they can learn and connect with God. We properly order it, right? Because the intention is to worship God. They just don't understand who God is yet. And as long as it's not inherently evil, we can do that. But the thing is that we cannot baptize things that have evil roots, right?
Yeah.
Like, when you do look at the roots of feminism, and maybe that would be a good time to sort of describe what are the roots of feminism, because I think we talk about it in such broad terms today. It can mean almost anything. It's like this word has lost all meaning. Feminism often today is like, for certain men, it's just anything that I don't like is feminist.
Right.
And then for women, it's like, it can mean so many different things to different women. So can we go through what is actually feminism as an ideology?
Yeah. So it gets complicated, exactly as you said, because I think women generally think, oh, it's just a way to help women. And, a lot of men who are not paying attention also think that, like, oh, it's just
Mhm.
about education and work and getting the vote for women.
Right.
But there's actually so much underneath it. And, really, and that actually is what spurred this book idea. Was I was putting together all of the pieces of the definition of feminism that I've sort of culled over the years, starting from the very, very roots of feminism. And as I started stacking them up, I looked at them and realized, these things actually have created a shadow church. They mimic Christianity and the way the church is structured. That it has its own commandments. It's got its own um, theological virtues, it's got a sacrament, it's got a way of evangelizing, all of these different pieces. And I think this is one of the reasons why it's so hard for women to get out of it, because it's become second nature to us. We just feel like this is the way,
We are inoculated into it. I
totally.
mean,
Yeah,
yeah.
completely brainwashed into it, indoctrinated for sure. Um, so anyway, so this at the start of it though, this is really, really important, is people need to understand that it starts with Mary Wollstonecraft, who was a um, 18th century thinker. She's considered the grandmother of feminism. And what most people don't realize is that this is a woman who was deeply connected with the very early men who called themselves revolutionary men. They were all Englishmen who were very much for the French Revolution. And if you start looking at her work, you can see that she's right along with them. And her mentor was this man named Dr. Richard Price, who was considered the first leftist thinker. And she's, by default then becomes the first leftist female thinker. And so she's in this group of men, most of whom went on to influence Karl Marx and the socialists in many ways. They were very much for the French Revolution. They were trying to get rid of the past, and they were trying to create this sort of godless, egalitarian culture. That's really the ideal. And Wollstonecraft herself, in her own writing, talks about superstition. So she's very much against it. Superstition is code for the Catholic Church. She thinks that the French culture requires she speaks actually in a positive way about the blood shedding, all the violence in the French Revolution. And, there's 20,000 people who lost their heads in the guillotine alone in Paris. I mean, that's to say nothing of all of the damage that was done and the people that died outside of the city itself. So this is incredibly violent. And she says, well, and she was there for some of it. She says, well, some of this is necessary because Christianity, or Catholicism in particular, has infantilized the French people. And so they need to grow up into kind of the rationality of the English. And this is the way
Oh,
to
just
do it.
killed me. The church's first daughter, the eldest daughter of the church. It's like,
Yeah.
oh
Yeah.
gosh, yeah.
So she's clearly thinking with them. But the other thing that's going on is this theological point that's really important, because I think a lot of times she's made out to look like this very pious Christian woman. But she starts out as an Anglican, then she becomes a dissenter against Anglicanism, and then ultimately she takes on Unitarianism. And this is they don't believe in the Trinity. Which is why they're called the Unitarians. They just believe in God. They don't believe in Jesus as a divine savior. And furthermore, Wollstonecraft herself actually sees that any kind of male mediation between a woman and God is going to be an obstacle to God. And so any pastor, priest, even Christ himself is simply an obstacle to her potential and her faith. And all of that, of course, is predicated on this idea of reason too. She has a very odd theological understanding of how it is that we get to God. She thinks it's through reason. So it gets very complicated very quickly when you start looking at the underbelly. And she's also very much she's part of this camp that ends up becoming what we know today, of course, is leftism. She's arguing against someone like Edmund Burke, who is considered the grandfather of conservatism. He was an Anglican, but he was very sympathetic to the Irish and to those who were Catholic. His mother and his sister were both Catholics. So it's really interesting. And he was very much saw the importance of tradition and faith in the culture at that time. So anyway, it's really, when you start looking at the details of it, things begin to skew very, very quickly. And then what happens, leaving Mary Wollstonecraft in terms of time, you move forward and you look at all of these American women who are, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, another woman named Matilda Gage, who's very little known, but ought to be known. They all became either Unitarians, like Wollstonecraft, or in McGage's case, she was very much into witchcraft. And actually, she is the mother-in-law of L. Frank Baum, who wrote The Wizard of Oz. She was the one that taught him how to do seances and get,
That was, oh
understood.
my goodness. I will say so much of this early history, it was gripping. Like I told you before we started recording, I was like, I didn't want to put down the book. I just was like, what is going on here? It's just like, I always say, like, what in the Old Testament is this? It's just like in the Old Testament, it's just like very salacious and scandalizing. Almost every chapter you go through in Genesis and Numbers, everything. But it's like kind of like this, the genesis of feminism, and you're like, what are these people doing? This is crazy. And in that I wrote, Unitarianism has its fingerprints everywhere. That
Yeah.
was one of my notes. It was just wild to me. I had no idea.
Yeah, no, and it was shocking to me too when I really started figuring out the pattern. And there is a really distinct pattern between these women as well. Some of that I didn't even have space to put in the book, but yeah, it's really amazing. Some of that is the brokenness that we saw that I wrote about in The End of Woman. But there's this distinct pattern between the parents of all these women, kind of some of the relationships they have. So anyway, it's really amazing. But the key piece that came about in the 1800s was Christianity is the enemy. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's very clear about this. Matilda Gage is clear about this. Susan B. Anthony ends up becoming an atheist, and is offended by, promoting it, or suggesting that she be a Christian. So that's a really key piece, is to see that they think that men have used Christianity to keep women enslaved. And they're trying to map their plight onto what's happening to the slaves in the United States, and make their case that they're experiencing the exact same thing, which of course is ridiculous.
Ludicrous. Yes.
These are the wealthiest middle or upper class women in the world, and they're trying to argue that somehow they're enslaved for various reasons. So anyway, yeah, it's really interesting when you start digging into just and there's a lot of misunderstandings too about like what was happening with women's education. Well, we're at a stage where industrialization is happening, and women are beginning to be educated in ways never before, but so are men. People had wealth, they had disposable income that they could then send maybe more than just their first son to get an education.
Right.
They were focused on that. And so even if you look at the United States, where the first religious orders are, all these women who are educating slaves in the South, the Ursulines, and all these amazing women. What's her name? I said the name wrong yesterday on a podcast. Elizabeth Ann Seton.
Yeah.
Which was funny because I had a relic of hers right next to me when I was fumbling her name. But in any event, Elizabeth Ann Seton was doing incredible work with education that included girls early at this stage. So I think that's another thing that people just get very indignant very quickly and think, oh, well, the women were so mistreated. But without really realizing the history and what was going on and what was actually happening. And the church was at the fore of that, because you can't have all of these women religious who are teaching students if they themselves are not educated. Like
Right.
there was this, started very, very early and was very important part of the faith of the Catholic Church, back in England and whatnot. So, and excuse me, even in Italy. So yeah, there's a lot that we don't know that I think gets glossed over, and we just kind of buy into this narrative of,
For sure.
what?
And it seems fairly unthinking to me. I mean, the Industrial Revolution really did create a very fertile soil for, I think, feminism to grow, combined with the Enlightenment, because especially too, this notion of working outside of the home, I feel like that was brand new. Families worked together, and women have always worked. I think that part also has been lost in the discourse when we hyperfixate on whether or not women should work.
Right.
For example, it's like women have always worked. They just worked with their husbands on their homestead, and they assisted. Now, Nancy Piercy writes about this, how actually the earliest child rearing books were written for men because it was assumed that men would be involved in the child rearing process. It wasn't exclusively for the women, which
Right.
I found to be fascinating, you
Yeah.
know?
Right.
Um,
Because you never hear that. Exactly. Yeah.
exactly. It's like, why aren't we talking, if we're talking
Mhm.
about going back to what's traditional, we shouldn't be talking about going to some 1950s notion of
Mhm.
feminism, of women, vacuuming their homes in high heels, doped up on something.
Right.
That's not why feminism started. It
Yeah.
wasn't it was the soil, everything was laid, the groundwork was laid far before the 1950s. So what shifted then in America, for example,
Mhm.
in say the 1950s, where all of a sudden we are seeing feminism really take root and grow pretty quickly.
Yeah, well, I think it's a combination of things. Certainly, the communist influence is huge, and that's something that we can't underestimate just how powerful that was. There's also this element of, and I write about this in the book. There's a Italian thinker named Augusto Del Noce who wrote in the 1970s. He talks about, the Marxist ideology isn't dead. He's looking back at Europe. He's looking back at what happened at the Bolshevik Revolution in the Soviet or in Russia. He's looking at the Second World War and just all the decimation there. He's looking at Maoist China, and he's saying this isn't over yet. Like there's this isn't exhausted. People haven't rejected socialism, communism out of hand. It's going to come back in a different way. So in 1970, he's actually writing this and saying it's going to come back in a way that is sugary, that is appealing, that makes people just drown in something saccharine and sweet. And he was right on. I mean, this is where the ideas of Wilhelm Reich come into play. He wrote in 1936 this idea of the sexual revolution. He's a Frankfurt thinker, and his ideas were completely absorbed in the 60s and 70s. And part of his idea was this twisting of the sexual, using a lot of Freud's ideas, where people believe that any kind of sexual restraint is actually disordered and is going to, you know, make people crazy or deform them or ruin their life or whatever. And so the idea was, how do we get this into the family and destroy the family from the inside out so that the parents lose their authority? The children are all addicted, and promiscuous, addicted to sexuality and promiscuous. So all of this is playing out in the 1960s and 70s, and then
And
of course,
wildly successful.
right, and then of course you have propaganda that's being used on women as well, and just this idea, and the whole goal of feminism is to make this new woman who is autonomous. That's the idol of feminism, and so women really bought into it because there's something very simple and appealing about it. I don't need anybody else. I just can do this and focus on myself. I don't have to wait to be asked out on a date or for someone to ask me to marry them. Like, it's all self agency. It's that there's no waiting on God, there's no prayer, there's no discernment, there's no surrender. It's all a way to for a woman to live her life without God and without other people, and to not have to pour herself out in a way for other people, serving others. So I think that's why it's also very popular, because it just feels really simple, and it's a great way for women without faith to feel like they're invulnerable, that they're really protected from those things that make us vulnerable and that make life challenging in a lot of respects.
You bring up this notion of like women, it being impossible for them to meet their potential, right? Is basically it's
Mhm.
a really pervasive mindset. I mean, I feel like growing up, anytime there were so many teachers and mentors in my life that would say like, "Oh, someday you're gonna grow up and do great things and
Mhm.
meet your potential," all of these things, but they never meant in motherhood.
Mhm.
It's like the unspoken thing. They never say
Yeah.
it, but it's assumed you're going to have a great career, you're gonna do all this stuff.
Yep.
And I was reading about Charlotte Perkins Gilman
Oh,
and
yeah.
how she posited exactly this. Like, you just see, she states it clearly and traces it back to how we have to deal with neglectful parenting, that kind of a thing.
Mhm.
Because unhappy mothers are going to be neglectful parents, and so we should just do away with the parenting and just women should just do whatever she wants. And then she actually literally abandons her 9-year-old child and
Yeah.
just does whatever she wants. I mean, it was just, as a mom, my oldest is 10,
Yeah.
and I couldn't, and I have 6 kids, and I'm like, how could you just do that? How could you just like
Yeah.
leave your 9-year-old child
Right.
and pass them off on family members and then just go live your life and feel no regret about that whatsoever? And the
Yeah.
impact that had on her child,
Right.
um, you wrote about it. She
Yeah.
resented her mom well into her 90s. I mean,
Right.
it wasn't like
She got
why.
over it and it was fine. Yeah. No, she was clearly very disturbed by it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like there is still a lot of that as a talking point. You speak to young women today and they're like, "Well, I chose an abortion because I didn't want my kid and my child deserves to be wanted." You
Mhm.
know, we need wanted babies.
Right.
And so it would be better off if we just killed them all,
Yeah.
right? Like that. It's just
Mhm.
very wild. So how is it that we have attempted we've taken this and we as a church, it's like this ideology is so
Mhm.
entrenched in our modern life that people have adopted this even as Catholic Christians. I
Mhm.
mean, people that I like, I mean,
Mhm.
people that I think are wonderful who would posit themselves being Catholic feminists.
Right.
How did why has there been this effort to marry the two when
Yeah.
it seems to me that these things are so different? I mean, it just
Yeah.
like you said at the beginning,
Right.
like they're from different sources. Why is that?
Yeah. No, I think that's a great question, and it's hard to answer in a lot of respects because the first thing that started this was the belief I think in the 80s and 90s, and it's still present today in the church, that we weren't going to really be able to win the culture war unless we became like feminists. I think this was something that was an idea somehow in the Beltway, and it just kind of took hold. People just really believed it and thought, okay, this is important. And here's John Paul II, who said, used the language of new feminism just a few times, but he used it, and people thought, okay, well, let's use this, but pivot with this and use it with what he meant. And that's probably where it started. The problem is, though, that that's not where it's finishing. You can still see this effort to sort of marry Catholicism and the first wave, which, as we've already talked about, are just incompatible.
Within the pro-life movement too. I mean, you have new wave feminists, you have feminists for life, you have the Susan B. Anthony list, you have all of these
Yeah, right. And
organizations that are feminist
And
rooted.
you have to remember just how powerful feminism was, especially in the 80s. When John Paul II's writing, even I read something of Christopher Lash's, and he died in the 80s, I think. And he's so bright and profound and so many great insights, but he's completely off on feminism. It's really interesting to see, like, had he lived longer, would he have come full circle and actually recognized it for what it was? And he talks about his daughter when he's talking about feminism. So you can see this desire of men who really want to see the best for their daughters and give them potential in life and career, all the things. But what they're missing is that this is not the way in which it is meant to be done. These are not authentically good things for women. And we see that in the fact that women are less happy. We see that in the fact that women
Yeah,
are now having pets and not children, or plants and not children. That, like, that desire for motherhood is still there. So
that nurturing,
anyway,
yeah.
so I think that's the root of it. So when this idea that feminism from the first wave could still be married with um, Catholicism came about, I think people were anxious to jump onto it and say, "Oh yeah, this is absolutely
I
an
did as a
extension."
20-something-year-old beginning to work in a national pro-life movement. I feel like when I worked for Students for Life of America, it was very in vogue to say, "I'm a pro-life feminist." Like,
Yeah.
"I'm just like you, lady on campus.
Mhm.
I'm a
Right.
feminist too, just like you.
And
I
that's
am pro-life."
exactly the driver. I think that's why
Yeah.
it stayed in vogue, is just this idea that women are like, well, we want to be able to bring people from the outside in back into the church. Now, there's some ways in which that has clearly happened. But the bigger problem is that women inside the church now look much more like women outside the church than they ought to. We're going to marry Wollstonecraft instead of Mary, the Mother of God. We're not, women don't know deeply the amazing stories of saints, the amazing writing about women that has been done. Edith Stein is really the only one that sort of gets used by these feminists, and then it's
Yeah.
usually very disordered, like, that's
Yeah.
not exactly what she meant, because she's very outspoken about how she doesn't believe in feminism, actually left it because she sees the ideological roots, especially rooted in the German Enlightenment, that she rejects completely out of hand. So she's really gets distorted in a lot of ways, and is not really part of the first wave movement at all, or an extension thereof, as is John Paul II. His ideas are
Yeah.
not either. Um, And, it's even been suggested that somehow these first wave women were influential upon him, which
Yes, I remember hearing like, "Oh, he's the feminist pope." Like, that was kind of
right.
the moniker that was given to him. "Oh, John Paul II, he's the feminist pope," and I believed that because I didn't know any better until I started reading things like Mulieris Dignitatem and things like that, and I was like, "Wait a minute."
Where the
Yeah,
word is never used. Right. Yeah.
yeah, I was like, "Yeah, that doesn't seem to me to fit in with the ethos that he is expressing here."
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's exactly right. And I go into that in the book in terms of what it looks like coming from him versus what's actually happening. And I think the other piece of it too is just that, in addition to, and women of very good will, but who want to reach out to others, but we have to look at what's happening in the church. And Catholic women are aborting and using birth control at almost the exact same rates as the rest of the culture.
Yep.
So we've been doing this for 30 years now, and there's not an
No.
improvement. This is a problem. The message of what the church teaches on these things is clearly not getting out to women. And I think because of this, priests are very hesitant to talk about it. They're afraid that they're going to get attacked or canceled, or their funds are going to get pulled from whatever fundraising project they've got, or the schools or kids are going to get pulled out. Like all of this. I mean, we know these things happen in the culture when women are disappointed or upset about
Well,
something.
you actually talked about this, how some of the earliest feminist movements were very violent in getting what they wanted. It was very a la Black Panther,
Yeah, yeah,
BLM, that kind of a thing.
yeah,
And it made me think of something that I recently read, or no, I heard it. I think it was a reel on Instagram or something. And some gentleman was talking about how women are so wildly aggressive now fighting for social causes.
yeah.
And he was speculating that it was because we have a natural maternal instinct to fight for our children, but these women are not having children. And so it's this displaced
Mhm.
protective mechanism that they have
Yeah.
towards other causes like
Mhm.
animals or the poor, immigrants, all these things, this displaced maternal
Right.
expression.
Yeah.
And would you agree with that? Because I mean, it seemed to resonate with me.
Yeah. No, and I have that in the book where I talk about this idea of misplaced compassion. And that's exactly right. We fight for abortion the way that women in the past would have fought for their own children.
Right.
So it's all that, but it's all directed out at others, and usually people that we don't meet, that we don't
Right.
have to engage with. It's become
Conveniently enough, yeah.
so it's something that you can fight for far away, but then you can just go home and live your life and take care of your plant and your dog and all of that. Like there's no localization to it.
Well, and there's no meaningful sacrifice made.
Exactly.
You
Yeah,
know what I
that's
mean? If you're not getting up in the middle of the night to fight for immigrants, you're not getting up in the middle of the night to
right.
generally take out your dogs and the neighbors' dogs and the
Yeah,
neighbors' dogs. It's like,
yeah.
yeah.
No, so it's very much I think a huge idea, an important idea is, and one of those things that I think is very hopeful to those of us who are taking care of our families, who are having children, is this idea of how important it is to do things locally, because it not
Yes.
only transforms your children and the things that you can hold and touch and be engaged with and accountable for, but it changes us, because exactly as you said, it requires sacrifice. It requires a transformation of us through doing things that are difficult, but we know are important to do because these are people we love and care for. So
Right.
it feels it connects back the properly ordered compassion when we start seeing it through that lens, instead of really what is in all college propaganda these days. Every college promotion, change the world.
Yes.
And actually that was one of the things I discovered was this book, by a woman named Esther Harding, who in the 1920s she's writing, and she says, this woman came to me and she said, I want to change the world. And she thought, that is the dumbest thing. I mean, she doesn't, I'm not quoting her.
Basically.
This is ridiculous. Can you believe this is what she thought? So it's really interesting to go back 100 years and see that this was not a thing back then. People understood the locality, the location, the
Yeah.
of being, and you can see also the roots of all the deep loneliness that people have, because women were the ones that were putting together
Yes.
events at church, or helping to care for those who just had a baby, or I know some of this still happens, but by and large women are too busy.
Yes.
They're focused on other things, and they don't see the importance or the role of how do we bring people together and check on them and love them in these ways that feel superficial or unimportant, but they're hugely important when you
Oh my
really.
goodness. Yeah, it's funny. I was just thinking Mother Teresa's quote of, if you want to change the world, start at
Mhm.
home, right? And it's like
From
she's
your
speaking
family.
directly to feminists. And I was thinking too, as you're describing, it's like women these days are the loneliest that they've ever been. They
Yeah,
have everything that they want,
right.
and
Except
they're the loneliest, exactly, except because we're made for relationship.
yes.
And it's really sad because I think the last couple of generations, it's like there has just been a complete disconnect between
Mhm.
transmitting the importance of family and nurturing in the home. It's like because these women were going off to work largely and letting school systems rear and raise their children. And I homeschool, but I understand there's a time and a place, right?
Yep.
And sometimes schooling is a great option, that kind of a thing. I'm not knocking that, but
Mhm.
we would be lying to ourselves if um, the normalization of sending your kids off to school so you can go to work or daycare, combined with no fault divorce,
Mhm.
abortion, contraception, all of these
Right.
things that really became a reality in America because of feminism
Yeah.
and this desire for women to be outside of the home, to be untethered to any social mores. Here we are. We're depressed. We're more anxious than ever. We don't have any children. We're not getting married. It is like the saddest situation
Yeah.
ever, you know? And then people aren't meeting normal milestones in life to mature and develop too.
Mhm.
I mean, I think that has been a huge contributing factor. It's like it's unfathomable the degree to which feminism has really rocked our culture. And so, before we maybe talk about a way back, let's talk about what are the commandments of feminism.
Mhm.
Let's look at the church structure in the Church of Feminism.
Mhm. Yeah, so this was a fascinating part that I discovered in my research for the End of Woman, but it's really become much more prominent in my mind in terms of just thinking about the cycle of feminism and how it's played out. We tend to think that what happened early doesn't have any connection with today. Well, the commandments were created by Percy Bysshe Shelley, who created a woman named Sithna, and Sithna was just a woman in his poem, but she had contempt for men. She was didn't believe in monogamy, and both of those ideas came from his in-laws, Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin. He Percy Shelley obviously never met Mary Wollstonecraft because she died giving birth to his wife, Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. Anyway, so he gets those ideas from them, contempt for men and promiscuity. And then he adds his own idea of the occult. And he embodies these ideas in this woman named Sithna in this poem called The Revolt of Islam. And as a result, those are the three pieces that sort of have become part and parcel of feminism. So if you look at women today, especially women in college, what defines them? The occult, promiscuity, and contempt for men. And I think that's underpinning a lot, obviously so many of the problems, because not only are those three things just these random commandments, they all match up with a different person of the Trinity. So if you have a problem with men, you're going to have a very hard time associating yourself with God the Father. If you are promiscuous, you obviously are going to have a hard time respecting your body as the temple of the Holy Spirit, and that relationship is going to be challenged. And then, of course, the occult goes against the authority of Christ as the Savior and King of the universe. So,
Wow, I just got goosebumps. Yeah, that's
yeah,
exactly it.
so
Yeah.
it makes it incredibly hard to then embrace Christianity at all when you have these absolute, you know, spiritual and even physical blocks, psychological blocks that have been created by feminism.
Right.
So that's an amazing thing, when you just start paying attention to it, and just seeing how widespread all of those elements are. I think that's that's why they have become the sacrament or the commandments, because this is what's going to shut you off from Christianity in ways that make it very difficult to get back to and to leave feminism.
And would you say the primary sacrament is abortion, or but too, I mean, just sexual degeneracy in general? I mean, you see there is a strong
Yes.
correlation they feed when you assert that women are no different than men,
Yeah.
and then you contracept and sterilize so that women lose the capacity for that one unique thing for which they are created, which is to generate life within their bodies.
Right.
It's very fitting, of course, with it being Advent, but it's like this is the fullest expression of femininity. This is peak femininity.
Giving.
And we are cutting it off at the leg and saying it's unimportant now. We're just like men. And
Yeah.
then and then you see the sexual degeneracy ensue because then it becomes there's again no tethers, no relational aspect to
Mhm.
intimacy. It is entirely about self-pleasure, just like Noche was kind of alluding to. Like this is the saccharine thing. You can do whatever you want,
Mhm.
free from any consequence. Of course, there are consequences,
Yeah.
but we're gonna pretend like there are no consequences.
Right.
And now we have this LGBT movement that has just I
Mhm.
think it's gotten ahead of itself. I think I now it's just untethered to any sort of semblance of reality.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so when that has been the fruit of feminism. So
Mhm.
as we look at the way that it's infiltrated the church, what do you like without being specific, what do you say to these women who
Mhm.
do believe that these things can be married? I mean, because in my mind, I'm like, how do we evangelize these women? How do we bring them into the fullness when they are suffering from these spiritual blocks, these
Mhm.
intellectual blocks?
Well, I think the first thing we need to do is just stop using the word feminism in any kind of positive light. I think, John Paul only used it 3 times. We've used the word a lot more in this conversation than he did in his whole pontificate. So I think that's an important and clearly he didn't have a problem communicating about women. This is another reason why we're told we have to keep feminism. The other thing is to, all of these things. I think, obviously, I wrote this book for this reason, and it's very difficult to distill these things down into, a soundbite.
Right.
That's one of the challenges, especially when you're dealing with a huge ideology that is so pervasive. Um, but I think the other piece, there's so many elements to it, but the other piece is just to really start digging into where's the fruit? What are we seeing happen in our church? What's happening in the culture? There's 30 million Catholic women in the United States. If we suddenly had Catholic women rejecting abortion and not using the pill, there would be absolutely a transformation in culture overnight, really.
Yeah.
And that's what we've allowed to just persist is that nobody wants to touch these issues. So we have to look at that. The other thing is to look at has feminism actually solved these problems that women have? And this was the amazing thing that I found. There was a book written in 1909 by a woman who was very critical of Mary Wollstonecraft. And she said, look at everything that she fought for. It didn't actually solve the problems that she thought she was solving. And that it's the same thing with the vote. And I'm not saying that women ought not to vote, but the point is that um, we think we're addressing one problem and we're not. The biggest problem that started with, as you mentioned previously, is the Industrial Revolution and the denigration of the home. Women lost their sense of purpose. And this is when feminism swoops in and says, oh, well, we'll give you purpose back. Your purpose is going to be as a man. And so all of the things that we think we're correcting, the abuse and the relationships, we're not correcting those. We're just sidestepping them. We're just pulling women out of any kind of opportunity for good or bad altogether. So feminism hasn't fixed that. And so I think the big fix needs to come back to an understanding of the beauty and the importance of the home, but also really back to this idea of the importance of men, giving men back their purpose,
Mm.
which is what this disdain and contempt for men and the patriarchy has wrought. And this is one of the pieces that's very much alive in Catholic feminism is this disdain for the patriarchy or this desire for men and women to be exactly the same, or at least very similar. And so that's one of the things that we have to deal with is get back to this idea of what is a patriarchy? What is the hierarchy? Well, who's at the top of it? Jesus is at the top of it. And
Yes,
this
it
is
is
inherently
inherently a patriarchy, whether we like it or not.
exactly. And this is the way which men function and organize. I mean, even if you look at the way the diocese system is set up in the world, it's pretty genius. Everywhere is covered for the most part by this hierarchy that exists and then expands out. And you see these tiers. There's nothing egalitarian about it. I mean, this is why we have a pope, and so that's why it seems like such a weird thing to have Catholic feminists upset about a patriarchy when it's just it works. It's effective. It's part of our system. You can't reject it. This is,
Well,
a
and I
piece.
think too, I think there's I just look at it and I think like, I think about how the patriarchy in my home, for example, it's not as if I have no power or influence. I mean, my husband, he is allowed to make the final decision on anything. That's fine by me. But the reality is I have a great deal of influence, and so I know how to wield that influence, and I don't feel like I'm a slave in my home, you know? I don't feel like I'm being taken for granted. I'm not saying that every woman has the same experience. I wish that they would, you know, but to me, it's like this is what a properly ordered patriarchy goes or what it looks like. And I actually think he has a tremendous amount of responsibility that I
Yeah.
personally I wouldn't want. You
Yeah.
know, for me personally, he is going to be responsible in a way for my family differently than I will be. He will be held to a higher account than I am.
Mhm.
And that's a tremendous amount of responsibility,
Yeah.
and so, like, with that authority does come with responsibility, and so I feel like that is often neglected in the conversation. We just think about it in terms of power and not in terms of responsibility and duty. Do you think that that's part of the problem in our conception of
Mhm.
patriarchy these days?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's the defining of it or absence thereof, and the idea that patriarchy is kind of machismo and something totally disordered. When in fact, it fundamentally patriarchy comes down to a kind of service. Obviously, it can be abused
Yeah.
and mistreated, but if a man understands patriarchy as a kind of service and his responsibility and role, it's a very different dynamic. And I think this is one of the reasons why we're seeing the whole problem with the manosphere situation is, and to even back up one further piece, the one of the things that's happened with feminism is that, in Christianity, we have faith, hope, and love as the theological virtues. Well, feminism has intentionally sowed its opposite: contempt, rage, and envy.
Mm,
Those are the theological virtues of feminism. And that they're very useful when you're focused on power and control. And this is what feminism is all about: power and control instead of service. So what's happened is that young men now see that, they've gone 2 or 3 generations, they've watched their grandfathers, their fathers sort of just roll over and just take the abuse from women, and they say,
yes.
"I'm not doing this. I'm not doing," but they also haven't seen ordered womanhood. They don't have memories of the grandmother who doted on them or the mother that cared for them very tenderly and was dialed into them and helped them, grow up and was right there for every step of their life. And so it's very easy to see that they now are taking this contempt and anger and envy that women have been dishing out, and they're coming right back in the exact same way. So it's
Yeah,
mirror images of the exact same thing. And
yeah,
neither one has got the perspective right. That this is about service, serving others, loving others, caring for others, and pouring yourself out for that. That's the Christian dynamic, is
yes,
pouring ourselves out like Christ, and that's where we find joy and happiness. It's a very simple reality, and yet it's gotten so skewed because we've bought into the doctrine of feminism and power and control. And so that's what young men are responding to, which it's actually kind of amazing to me that it didn't happen sooner. You can see the patience of men and who really want to help their wives and daughters, and it gets very personal to them, and they don't want to speak up. But it's gone to the point where,
they don't wanna fight fire with fire, right? Like,
yeah,
that
exactly.
they
But
are afraid to
what the
do that.
young men are doing with sort of this red pill is this
Yes,
idea:
and it's
"You're gonna
frightening.
hold us in contempt, we are gonna hold you in contempt." And so
Yeah,
it's not we're not actually bringing healing and order to it. We're just, making the battle of the sexes
yeah.
worse than where we were, to start off with. So yeah, it's really tragic to see what's happening. But I think if we can speak positively about the patriarchy, one of the things that I discovered, which is really amazing, is to see every culture that is a matriarchy that's really led by women, it ends up in kind of a ghetto, because women's instincts are to keep children close and to nurture them, but not to really refine and push them out into the world with their gifts. So
Mm,
you see this like with a young girl's sexuality, kind of in a ghetto situation, and especially if she's being promiscuous. Well, a good father says, absolutely not. Your sexuality is important and precious, and it needs to be protected and saved for your husband. Meanwhile, he's also pushing her out to do other things in the world. Same thing with the son. He sees in them this capacity to protect the things that are precious and then push them out into the world in a way in which they're ready for. And that's what creates the success. When the patriarch is doing his job, the culture can really flourish in a way that matriarchy won't permit, because matriarchs don't, those are the things women just don't think about naturally when
Mm.
raising their own children. Our goal is to keep close and be more permissive. In a
Yeah,
lot of
and to
respects. So,
protect them, right? Because watching our and to protect our children, because watching them suffer is excruciating, and that's why we look to Our Lady of Sorrows and we say, I mean, this capacity for her to have compassion on her son, to be present with him in his suffering,
yeah.
is unfathomable. I mean, it's incredible. So, I think that's really important. Do you think, I'm just thinking about this now, like, do you think we still use the same terminology of patriarchy,
Mhm.
or do we have to find a different way to describe this? Because I do feel like the red pill movement, if you say the word patriarchy to them, they are thinking this false machismo.
The bigger thing is, especially among Catholics, is this piece of contempt and rage and anger and envy. That has to be washed out. That none of those are theological virtues. They're
Right.
all vices, and they're all incredibly corrosive, and they cannot build. You cannot build anything on that. And that's really what we're allowing and to be perpetuated and to continue. I mean, obviously we can look at the political world, and it's like at this fever's pitch. But this is, if we're very serious about our spiritual life, all of that is just going to eat you alive. It's going to be incredibly difficult to find your way to heaven if you're continually fostering and adding, logs to that fire in your own life. It's going to destroy you. And I think we've seen examples of that, where people just get so angry, they're just consumed by the anger and no longer have the capacity to really hear the voice of Christ, to hear the Holy Spirit, to hear what it is that they're meant to do in the world, because they feel so justified in this anger. So that seems to be an important thing, is just contemplative prayer and finding the way to wash that out. And for all of us, I mean, all of us are broken and suffering from so many different things. And we're not, you can't, and this is one of the problems with the feminists, is that much of what drives them is this brokenness, and this sense of, I'm broken and this happened to me, and I'm allowed to remain in this victimhood status, instead of saying, Christ, I surrender this to you. You have to heal this. You have to take care of this. And so anyway, I think that's one of the most important things, is getting back to the basics of our life, the sacraments, confession, prayer. This is really only where the real restoration is going to happen, and the sense that we have to build things again, because right now it's just a tremendous amount of tearing down, destroying families. That's not really building. That's just more destruction,
Mm.
sowing confusion, all of that. So I think these are really important pieces that, especially in the church, we have to talk about, and just no longer accept the fact that people filled with rage, are allowed to have some kind of a platform when, that is really,
Yeah,
awful.
it has just been social media has been tremendously detrimental, I think, to
Yeah,
male-female relations,
yeah,
on
you're right.
every level. We haven't even touched
Mhm.
pornography, but I mean, it's
Yeah.
like that is a lot of it too, like the objectification of women. And so, well, if you're gonna objectify me, I'm gonna take the power for myself, and I'm just gonna objectify myself.
Yeah.
It's just this very warped perception of how we relate to one another. And my husband, he always goes, "Oh, all that stuff is like fake. Like all that online stuff is fake." And I say,
Mhm.
"It is, but it's not, because now
Right.
people have the ability to share their deepest inner thoughts
Mhm.
under some sort of anonymous account, and other people run with it. Like it changes the way we shape and view the world, because language is creative. I mean, it
Exactly.
shapes our worldview. And so, um, I feel like social media and people having platforms that they ought not to have,
Mhm.
um, and I feel
Well,
like a hypocrite
I
saying
don't
it, you know what I mean?
I think the big piece is really just, what are we paying attention to? Where are we putting our energies? That needs to be
Yes.
the bigger piece. It's not so much that we need to go out and start canceling people.
Right.
The question of, things will continue that we either give money to, or we pay attention to, or we're watching.
Right.
And that has to be, our focus has to be on things that are life-giving instead of things that are draining us. Um,
Totally agree.
so I think that's an important aspect of it as well. But yeah, no, it's just incredibly tragic. I think that the fact that and actually one of the things that is really interesting, and this is not in the book, so I'd love to actually hear what you think about this,
Hmm.
is, there's a fundamental vice that all of us have, which is pride. And we talk extensively about men's fundamental vice after pride, which is lust. But most of us don't ever talk about what women's fundamental vice is. And I think that's one of the things
Vanity.
that feminism really brings out, is this idea of envy. Because we're always in comparison, we're always in some kind of competition with women. So this
Interesting.
is one of the
I
reasons.
would thought vanity maybe would be, but I guess vanity and envy do go hand in hand in that regard
Yeah,
because
because you're
yeah,
always trying to be better than other women.
right.
Even just thinking about like female run organizations, that there's always challenges in there in that dynamic.
And the women in those organizations rarely are feminine in their behavior. Like
Yeah,
whenever
right.
that's the thing that always kills me is that when you have 9 times out of 10 a woman running an organization, she bulldozes over everybody.
Right.
And
Yeah.
people don't like working with her.
Yeah.
She is the Meryl Streep of The Devil Wears Prada, and Christian organizations are not immune from this at all.
Yeah. No, and so anyway, I think it's just really interesting to even
Yeah,
start having a conversation about this, because if women are envying men and men are lusting women, we've sort of created this whole cycle of, just continual brokenness, because we want
right.
the wrong things from the other person. We will either want to be like them, or we just want to abuse them. Anyway, so you can kind of see this perfect storm that the devil is really exacerbating by making it look like the envy of women is a virtue. Um,
Right.
it's good that we want to be like men. So anyway, I just, like I said, I'd love to hear more of what you think of that, because it's not really brought up. You don't hear about it in um, you don't hear about it like an examination of conscience. Like, I think
Right.
I've thought about writing an examination of conscience for women, because there's some very specific things that are very easy to hide if we're not paying attention to just our fundamental relationship with other women and
Well,
our
in our interior lives, I think we're just so disconnected because we're constantly consuming. I was just talking to a friend of mine about this a little bit yesterday because I was scrolling on social media and I saw this young woman. She's wearing a veil. She's got tons of goth makeup on, which is fine. I don't care about how people do their makeup, but it was the whole we're turning Catholicism into an aesthetic, and we're pouting at
Mhm.
the camera, and we're posing. And my thought was unfollow vanity, unfollow vainglory, unfollow all these things. And I think it's
Yeah.
not that these women are consciously aware they've been groomed to behave this way online because there's such a
Mhm.
strong feedback loop on social media with likes and all of this stuff, but it feeds into that lustfulness and the simping so-called because
Right.
um men are attracted to that and women know that's attractive. And
Right.
so it's like, how do we curate an algorithm, which is basically what you have been describing? I was in discussion with this friend of mine. How do we encourage people to curate an algorithm where they are consuming things that are good, true, good, and beautiful, that
Mhm.
are edifying and building up their spiritual lives, but they're not being consumed by their social media. And I think we spend so much time with our nose online that we forget how to sit with ourselves in silence and in the presence of God. And I think when you
Mhm.
start to sit in more silence, then you become far more aware of what is the orientation of my heart in this moment.
Yeah.
So when you are posing for your camera,
Mhm.
and you're posting it online for whatever reason, why am I doing this? Why am I
Mhm.
posing this way? And
Right.
you start to realize it is kind of that root of vanity. It is envy. I want people to like my photos. Well,
Yeah.
why is that? Like, are we so I don't know. I think that's a really interesting thing. We need to pray the litany of humility more, and we need to spend more time in silence, I think.
Yeah. No, without a doubt. But I think, the other thing, like you said too, there needs to be better models of what,
Totally.
fundamentally making attractive what is authentically good, true, and beautiful, like you mentioned. And Mother Teresa is obviously such a great example of this, the woman who's objectively not attractive. but everybody said was so beautiful. That understanding of where true beauty comes from, and
Yes.
just the importance of being a reliable woman. I think
Yeah.
that cannot be overstated. It's so interesting to watch the dynamics of what happens when women really are reliable, and you can count on them and you trust them, and just how that's an example and model that we don't see enough of in the culture, in a way that's people really start seeing the difference between vanity versus just authentically good. A woman who's really desires and longs to.
Unassuming, just that woman who is unassuming and warm. Like, I think that's what people are
Yeah, I
are
think that.
drawn towards.
Yeah.
Unassuming and warm. Like, I think about the times I encountered a very healthy functioning family dynamic.
Mhm.
Like, I can
Mhm.
distinctly remember going to a friend's house of mine. She's one of 11 kids. And so she and her siblings and like nieces and nephews, everyone's just like having a crazy wild time. And I
Yeah.
just remember sitting and basking in that environment because it was
Mhm.
so healthy. And just
Right.
the way that everyone spoke to each other and helped each
Mhm.
other. I took it all in and I left. And I actually felt more energized because I was like, that was the most edifying and beautiful experience I've had in a very long time. And it wasn't because they said anything to me. It
Mm.
wasn't because they were like going out of their way. They were just living their normal life. And it was the most beautiful, healthy thing I had experienced in such a long time. And I thought, like, this is what it's supposed to be like. This is what family life is supposed to look like. And they have a ton of kids. Many sacrifices had been made to get to that point, and yet this is building your legacy. This is building up the kingdom of God.
Right.
Um, so I think we need to be more intentional about
Mhm.
curating and cultivating that.
Right, and I think it boils down to that idea of what you said earlier. Just women are meant to be life-giving, and that doesn't mean you have life and then create chaos out of it.
Right.
But it's a sense of nurturing and order, comfort, all the things that the home is really meant to be. And we're seeing this is the problem without it is not only are women has the home been decimated, but women are losing the capacity to be compassionate towards their own children.
Yeah.
And that's the real tragedy, is just that incredible break with something that's so both biologically but also psychologically
Yeah.
fundamentally comes to women, especially when they give birth. But we've lost that concept altogether because we've come to believe that there's a break between motherhood and the feminine. So
There is so much. I honestly, oh my goodness, that's a whole nother episode, but I better stop because I will continue to go down that road because I have a lot of thoughts on that. I've always thought, like, if I were to ever write a book, it would be essentially about that
yeah.
exact topic. So tell everyone who's listening, where can they order Something Wicked? Why Feminism Can't Be Fused with Christianity?
If you want a copy that is signed by me or even personalized to you, the best place is theologyofhome.com. Can also get it at sophiainstitute.com, the publisher, or Amazon, or anywhere where great books are sold. So um,
Excellent.
that's the best place.
Thank you so much for coming on to talk about this and for bearing patiently with me while my kids were
Oh,
in and out of the office.
it's only fitting, right? You should have
This is what it's all about, right? Well, thank you so much, Carrie, and I hope to have you on again soon.
I'd love it. Thanks so much.